This evening is Distinguished Honorary Professor at the ANU, Professor Gareth Evans. He has an impressive CV that will be known to most as a Cabinet Minister in the Hawke and Keating Labor governments from 1983 to 1996. In the posts of Attorney General, Minister for Resources and Energy, Minister for Transport and Communications, and as Minister for Foreign Affairs from 1988 to 1996, he is a welcome and important voice in this debate. Tonight, he will speak on the politics behind the AUKUS decision and outline what a comprehensive and genuinely objective review of AUKUS might look like if the Labor government actually undertook one. Over to you, Professor Evans.
Well, thank you very much, Kelly, and it's a great opportunity to talk to you all, and I appreciate the invitation. The AUKUS submarine deal has profound implications, none of them positive, for Australia's security and our sovereignty. Our embrace of it owes far more to political calculation, opportunism at the outset, and now nervousness as to the electoral consequences of changing course than it does to sound strategic judgment. The deal is a gift both to the US and the UK, with no obvious downsides to either of them, but one very much at odds with our own national interest, which we will very long regret. In Australia, domestic political considerations have been a central factor really from the outset. For the Morrison government, it may be that the primary driver of their AUKUS decision was their ideological passion of coalition ministers for all things American, with much massaging in this respect going on from their hugely influential advisor, Andrew Shearer. But it's very hard to deny that political opportunism came a close second. Morrison was deeply conscious of the opportunity the deal presented to wedge the Labor opposition in the defence and security space, where the ALP has long been perceived, rightly or wrongly, as being electorally vulnerable. That the nuclear dimension of the deal was bound to ruffle some feathers in Labor ranks was, for Morrison, very much an added political attraction. I actually was not critical at the time, and nor am I now, of the opposition's initial response in September 21, when told at the very last minute by Morrison of the imminent announcement of the deal that he struck with the US and the UK, which was in fact premised on Labor's support. The political imperative then was pretty clear. Had Labor been at all equivocal, 2022 would have been a khaki election, with Albanese depicted as undermining the alliance and undermining US commitment to the region. Moreover, it has to be acknowledged, although I suspect a number of participants in this webinar won't agree, it has to be acknowledged that the deal seemed at least prima facie to have some intellectual defensibility, with nuclear propulsion clearly superior in terms of speed, endurance, longevity underwater, and at least for now, detectability. And with nuclear proliferation and waste concerns being on the face of it, at least prima facie, reasonably met by the lifetime sealed character of the highly enriched uranium character of the propulsion units. As I said publicly at the time, the Morrison government was roundly to be criticised for comprehensively mishandling the breakup with the French. And there were very real decisions that still had to be answered before the submarine deal was finally bedded down. In particular, as to whether the force configuration proposed was really fully fit for Australia's own strategic defence purposes, and also the implications, and this is key to a lot of what's going to follow, the implications of much greater enmeshment with the United States military for the reality of our own sovereign agency. But as I argued then, there was plenty of time when Labor came into power and government for review, renegotiation, readjustment. What I am now critical of, and very critical, is that when Labor did come into power a few months later in May 22, it's clear that no such review of the whole AUKUS project deal ever took place. Then, or even a year later, in the purportedly comprehensive Defence Strategic Review, which was led by Stephen Smith and Angus Houston. Critical questions were never seriously addressed. Clearly articulated answers to them have never been given by the Prime Minister, the Defence Minister, or anyone else. And the answers that are in fact emerging as further time passes are very deeply troubling. If a genuinely comprehensive and genuinely objective review were now to be initiated by the Albanese government, it would, I believe, have no choice but to make these 5 major findings, which constitute the core of the critique that I continue to make with Paul Keating, Bob Carr, and many others about this deal. 1, there is zero certainty of the timely delivery of the 8 AUKUS boats. We now know that both the US and the UK have explicit opt-out rights. And even in the wholly unlikely event that everything falls smoothly into place in the whole vastly complex enterprise, transfers of the US Virginias, British design and build of the new boats, human resource availability, manageable costs, all the rest. Even if all that implausibly falls into place, we'll be waiting 40 years for the last boat to arrive, posing obviously very real capability gap issues. Second, even if we were to acknowledge, for the sake of this argument, and objectively it's some truth, even if we were to acknowledge the superior capability of the nuclear-powered subs, the final fleet size, 8 of these big boats, big beasts, if their purpose really is the defence of Australia, really appears hardly fit for that purpose. Just how much intelligence gathering, or archipelagic choke point interception, protection, or sea lane protection, or even just deterrence at a distance, if you accept that, how much of any of that will be possible given the usual operating constraints, which mean that only 2 of those boats will be deployable out there in our vast maritime environment at any one time. Only 2 boats. 3, the eye-watering cost of the AUKUS submarine program will make it very difficult, short of a very dramatic increase in the defence share of GDP, with all that that implies for other national priorities, make it very difficult to acquire the other capabilities that we will need if we'd have any kind of self-reliant capacity in meeting an invasion threat if one were ever to occur, if one were ever to arise. Those capabilities include, in particular, state-of-the-art missiles, aircraft, and drones that are arguably even more critical than submarines for our defence in the event of such a crisis. 4th, and this is where the rubber, I think, really hits the road, the price now being demanded by the United States for giving us access to its nuclear protection technology is now, it's becoming ever more clear, extraordinarily high, indefensibly high. Not only now the open-ended expansion of Tindal as a US B-52 base, which will be, of course, comprehensively addressed a little later on tonight by Richard Tanter and Vince Scappatura, not only the conversion of Stirling submarine base into a major base for the US Indian Ocean Fleet, making Perth now join Pine Gap and the Northwest Cape, and increasingly likely Tindal, as a potential nuclear target. Not only the demand for what's now described, not only as the interoperability, but as Kellie said in introduction, the interchangeability of our submarine fleets. But also, in addition to all of that, the ever clearer expectation on the United States side that integrated deterrence means Australia will have no choice but to join the United States in fighting any future war in which the US chooses to engage anywhere in the Indo-Pacific, particularly over Taiwan. It defies credibility to think that in the absence of that last understanding, the Virginia transfers will ever proceed. And the notion that we'll retain any kind of sovereign agency in determining how all these assets are actually used should serious tensions erupt is frankly a joke in bad taste. I've had personal ministerial experience of being a junior allied partner of the United States in a hot conflict situation. In my case, the first Gulf War, the good Gulf War in 1991. And my recollections of that experience, without spelling it now publicly in any more detail, are not pretty. The United States takes its allies extremely for granted in these situations. The notion of any residual independent decision-making agency, forget it, doesn't happen. Finally, fifth thing I think any such comprehensive review would need to find, if it was being at all objective, is that the purchase price that we're now paying for all its exorbitance will never be enough to guarantee the absolute protective insurance that supporters of AUKUS think that they're buying. ANZUS, it can't be said too often, does not bind the United States to defend us militarily, even in the event of an existential attack. An extended nuclear deterrence is as illusory for us as for every other ally or partner believing itself to be sheltering under a United States nuclear umbrella. The notion that the United States would ever be prepared to run the risk of sacrificing Los Angeles or Tokyo or Seoul, let alone Perth, is and always has been nonsense. We can rely on US military support if Washington sees this as being in the United States' own national interest to offer it, but not otherwise. Washington will no doubt shake a deterrent fist, and it will threaten and deliver retaliation if its own assets on Australian soil are threatened or attacked. But that's as far as our expectations should extend. The bottom line in all of this, I think, was very presciently stated by Jean-Yves Le Drian, the then French Foreign Minister, in reacting to the Morrison decision in 2021, when he said, and I quote, "The Australians place themselves entirely at the mercy of developments in American policy. I wish our Australian partner, who made the choice of security justified by the escalation of tensions with China to the detriment of sovereignty, will not discover later that it has sacrificed both." In the event that some of this political light did start to dawn on the Albanese government, and it did start to now explore a plan B, it wouldn't be impossibly late, at least technically, to fundamentally change course yet again, with the most attractive option probably being, if Paris ever felt able to trust us again, the revival of the French contract. This not only provided, you remember, for the delivery of 12 conventionally powered but very capable boats at a reasonable cost and within a reasonable time frame, but also did explicitly allow for a nuclear propulsion option to be pursued should we so desire. Making such a change now would involve obviously much more time and expense and some new and quite serious complications in working out how to manage the nuclear refueling and maintenance needs of a low-enriched LEU uranium system. But overall, as distinct from an HEU closed unit system, but overall, I think it would involve much less baggage for us than continuing with the AUKUS program. All that said, it has to be acknowledged that the odds of any fundamental change, of course, are now very long indeed. The only external event that could completely derail the AUKUS program and force such change would be for the United States to make it clear that it was not going to give up any of its Virginias because of the pressures on its own replacement program. But it's hard to imagine even a Trump administration doing that, given the extraordinary favourability of the deal that the United States has wrung out of Australia, not only financially, but because for all practical purposes, the Americans will be able to treat these boats as an extension of their own fleet. The prospects of a political change of heart in Australia are even more problematic. On the part of the coalition, in the absence of the reincarnation of Malcolm Turnbull, they're non-existent. And on the part of the ALP, they're really, I have to concede, not much better. I've referred elsewhere to Richard Marles, Defence Minister Richard Marles' love of the United States as being so dewy-eyed as to defy parody. Foreign Minister Penny Wong is far more beady-eyed and instinctively wary of overcommitment to America's view of itself, but she's been unwilling to rock the political boat. And the Prime Minister himself, Albo, not only has never given much attention to the complexities of defence and foreign policy, very unusual for the Labor left, but he does remain politically deeply risk-averse, preoccupied more than anything else with not being portrayed domestically as weak, vacillating on security. So all of this finally really is very depressing for those of us who've long nurtured the belief that Australia is a fiercely independent nation, ever more conscious of the need to engage constructively, creatively, and sensitively with our own Indo-Pacific neighbourhood, and with a vibrant multicultural society ever more representative of the world around us. A country, moreover, which had come to terms at last with the reality that in the new century, our geography really does matter much more than our Anglophone history. And a country which had put behind it the fear of abandonment, which had been so central to our defence and diplomacy for so much of the last century, recognising, as Paul Keating continues to put it so articulately, that we need to find our security in Asia, not from Asia. So, as I've been saying publicly for some time, echoing Keating, Australia's no-holds-barred embrace of AUKUS is more likely than not to prove one of the worst defence and foreign policy decisions this country has ever made. Not only putting at profound risk our sovereign independence, but generating more risk than reward for the very national security it promises to protect. I can't imagine this decision being made by any of the Hawke Keating governments of which I was part, even when Kim Beazley was Defence Minister. Times, unfortunately, have changed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Evans, and you've given a very sobering assessment. But I wish to thank you for adding your voice, because it helps to galvanise the citizenry into really thinking about how to scuttle AUKUS. Even though the prospects seem poor, you just never know with political pressure and people talking about the issue and writing about the issue and agitating for change. You know, there's always some hope. But thank you very, very much on behalf of many people who have been campaigning against AUKUS for a very long time for adding your voice. I'll move on. I'm conscious of the time, and I know